neat. What is it?
Oh, it's from New Guinea. It's a ceremonial spirit box.
Wow, that's cool. What do you do with it?
You put your weed in there.
Oh, thank you.
This is neat. Is this from South
You
America?
bet. That's a Yanomami ancestor idol from Brazil. It's carved from deer bone.
What do you use it for?
You put your weed in here.
Okay.
No problem.
Where's this from?
Oh, it's from Borneo. It's for a Sulawesi puberty ritual. It symbolizes the journey into adulthood.
Really?
Yeah, and you put your weed in here.
So this has actually been used in puberty rituals?
Yeah, and you put your weed in there.
Thanks.
Excuse me.
Oh, this is...
Have you ever seen a hairless chimpanzee? Ancient humans were essentially wild animals, and there is no reason to believe they had a physique any less impressive. Many people would believe that ancient humans were disheveled and physically inferior to modern humans, but truth be told, ancient humans would have had physiques that would match any modern athletes. The thick bones and skulls of ancient humans tell us that they possessed remarkably androgenic constitutions, meaning they had exceptionally high levels of testosterone. They also led physically demanding lives involving hunting great beasts with nothing but crude spears, and ate meat-based diets with levels of protein and nutrients that are unmatched by any modern diet.
The systems projected from the estimate include the long-standing Satan worship from the function, which is a series of traps in order to deceive people into the functionality of being turned into basically cattle. And the historic variant of the deal with the devil would have to have been generically benign without the additional component of having discovered the secret loopholes, at which point the corruption of the contracts in a useful and functional way would be the mechanism to ensnare them into the larger systems of power, generating the stages in society of the hierarchies, the series of hierarchies generating the variance on the diversity of any genetic differences by any biological experiments by their wizard society, generating the positions similar to our modern day codes, such as with COVID, and the functionality of secret experiments with the military and intelligence agencies, such as Fauci with the COVID and the rest of those systems of gain of function, which generates their ability to engage in the manipulation of adding variation to diseases, which in the position of hierarchy would genetically diversify people into the staged categories based upon the gains of functions from the CRISPR systems, which infecting the body would generate the alternatives, at which point the desirable thing for society historically in the United States would have considered homosexuality to be a disease, at which point the position of homosexuality in a CRISPR society would actively try and find the defect and actively try and remove it, creating a perpetually edited system until you generate your super babies, at which point your goobermenches would be created by the wizard cults, generating their superior forces, at which point the diversification allows for the societies to be able to manufacture their various competitions based upon their specialties, at which point the higher you invest into the viral infections of the gain-of-function systems, you generate higher and higher damages by the infections, such as if you have some kind of advanced poison oak type system as a virus, which generates their ability to create rashes on and around the body would generate, as a virus, being able to infect the entirety of the body, being able to turn a normal white man into a red person, at which point the added position of having created a cattle society would generate the interest of referring to them in the cattle category, at which point the advancements in the biological development would have been the breeding and evolution of the creation of cattle-human hybrids, at which point you'll have your Tauruses and you'll have your various nymphs and the full diversity of everything. And if this, combined with the rest of the system of an internet connected by psychedelics, then you would have the active engagement of a high society, at which point the high society actively being able to tap into the fairy realm of the psychedelics advanced into an internet from the psychedelics would generate their own version of society, at which point you, to enter the fairy realm, would have to be able to have access to their internet, which they could choose to apply or not to apply on the basis of whatever mechanism in their technologies and codes they would apply, generating the systems of compounding narratives and variations. Now, historically, such as in Europe, such as in England with Robin Hood, you have this series of a base legend, which actively being entertaining would generate additional bards to add and complicate the narratives until the finished product would look anything like the original, at which point you have the oral traditions generated by their preferred refined variant of the reality, at which point the base reality would look substantially different, but their internet reality of the refined narratives would in fact be able to craft a real life in practice version of the thing, as the entire arrangement of the internet is the culmination of collective arts, at which point the collective arts would normalize the variation from the reality, at which point the story version is its own living, breathing system built on the base reality, which could have a version of that story, but wouldn't find it particularly relevant, as the two would not functionally match from the edits and refinements, at which point you have the variations of the different societies which would actively engage in the contest against each other, such as the development of predator species in order to use as bioweapons. Now, if you have some large mechanisms, such as dinosaurs or dragons, then you could actively destroy them with the larger bioweapons. And if you do not have access to the larger dinosaur-type creatures, you would have to create variations of predators, at which point the in-practice variation of predators would generate the alterations, such as your special entities from these viral changes, at which point you would be able to create genetic diversities with augmentations in technology, such as if you have a viral infection which creates some variant of vampirism, then your ability to change the biology into something that digests different to human bodies but has a similar look to the humanoid, you would generate the ability for it to ingest into those special components in order to consume the parts of the blood that they wouldn't have normally been able to in a human stomach, because it's going into a different system, at which point the thing that would keep them alive would be the virus, which would not require our human version of living, at which point they would be considered immortal or undead on the basis of being sustained by the viral ecosystem, at which point this viral ecosystem, being able to sustain the body indefinitely as long as it is allowed to be in existence, would actively seek to upgrade its hosts. And its ability to upgrade its hosts would require it to find a more and more desirable person, both attractive and in power. At which point, the culmination of the generic, arbitrary nature of a regular predator with immortality, generating their ability to engage in their infection of society and actively progress on the basis of choosing its prey for the sake of that immortality, at which point its biological gut chooses what it's interested in. The human body, if you're used to sweets, will celebrate the use of sweets, and if you're used to healthy food, then you'll be used to healthy food, and that's what your body will actively crave, and it will reject sweets. And if you're starving, you'll actively seek nutrients over the functionality of sweets or refined foods, at which point you have these systems of normalized variation, which, being applied to these super predators created in the prehistory, would generate your ability to systematically have its preference towards the certain types of blood, as that would be the thing consumed, at which point the systems of having created the royalty network generates their obligation to ascend in a general structure which they're consuming as they go up the hierarchy, depleting their entire body of the virus and going into the next host, creating the ecosystem from the viral infection, having to be able to engage in the complete change, would have to have the ecosystem of viruses collectively go into a sustainable amount until it could truly infect the entire system, at which point it would be able to go from one to the other, at which point the one that had given the ecosystem to the next one would be on a death cycle, as it would no longer have this sustaining mechanism of the permanent living conditions or immortality of the viral ecosystem or culture, at which point it would actively move up in importance, at which point it would seek the most powerful and it would seek the most attractive, and it will culminate at the most attractive once it has acquired all of its desired power, at which point it would have the most attractive, most powerful. Now, certain theories have suggested that the position of vampirism as specifically being scared of light would be derived by its base predatory nature, at which point the systems of defense against this would create a trap society which has a problem created by the solution. The solution, having already existed, could refer to itself on the holy and glorified variant, at which point the holy version or the light version, you can call it some kind of Lucifer or morning star or the daybreak, at which point the star just before the daybreak, being the system specifically that threatens the vampirism in question, would actively have the competition between the two systems. Each of them needs the other one. The power of the Luciferian is their ability to control the vampirism and the undead, and the undead cannot sustain themselves without being propped up by the Luciferians, at which point the solution was the problem the entire time, at which point you have the deals with the devil, and then you have the secret loopholes which the clever would find and extort, which would generate the mechanism of the greater injury as they become less and less human, they become more and more entrapped into the system. They, in their arrogance, think they're getting away with something, when in fact they're becoming more and more confined on the general system until they have fully dealt with the entirety of what they could get from it, and they are stuck on an exponential loop of the Hell Society generated by the Lucifer in question, at which point you have these systems of psychological traps for higher society which would actively be competing with each other, at which point you would have the full diversity of the mechanisms, at which point you have an entire complete mythological diversity in creatures and humanoids, which would actively be able to create their own aspect of the society until they've acquired their goal, at which point, when they've served their purpose and can be replaced, the position isn't very interesting in order to replace them. They've served their purpose and they can be destroyed. And having removed their security by conducting their service to the point of removing what allows them to stay, allows them to be killed off, at which point they are useful until they're not. And they, in their greed pursuant to their desired outcome, would eventually consume themselves into their eradication. Not because they are taxing on the larger system, mind you, but because they have completely removed the ecosystem specifically designed to secure them. And having removed the part that secures them, they are fully vulnerable. And at that point, you have the progress of genociding them and having replaced them with a different variant of what they were doing. The system can refine itself exponentially until you exclusively have your Goobermenches. In those types of wizard societies, where their ability to have created the system would have been taken for granted, the disposing of an entire race like they would a stray dog would not significantly even come up into their thinking, at which point their willingness to engage in large-scale genocide would fundamentally seek a benign taste in their mouth. They wouldn't think twice about it, as it would not be significant. They themselves do not respect life or diversity in the life. They are merely seeking the higher refinement of their faction of the total system. At which point, these systems, having progressed under the theory from a previous system of pure communism, they would be pursuing these aggression towards the position of the manufacturer of Nazi-type fascism, at which point the desire for Hitler to try and discover historic validation of his theories would have been, by point of fact, possible and even probable with more competence than they would have been manufactured, at which point their pursuing of the subject, knowing that their base communication was fraudulent, would actively subvert the larger logic strings or lines of thinking which would have generated the positive desired result. At the top of the positive desired result, they would discover the larger trap inside these types of structures, which, having found the loophole in the base agreement, would discover that they would have been stuck in a death spiral into a perpetual loop, which generates an undesirable conclusion for them, at which point they would have to choose to destroy themselves or abandon their base quest. As the old saying goes, the fools know enough to to think that they know something and not enough that they know nothing. They have studied just enough to feel confident, and they don't have enough collective competence in order to understand that they don't know anything about what they're dealing with. They are systematically falling into traps which they should have been competent enough to understand, as they themselves construct the same exact structure of traps under the understanding that these traps are predatory in nature. They, being the sucker in that con, is something that they could have been able to generate conceptually, but they, in their arrogance, would actively seek to ignore it under the position and delusion. It's like another saying that it's easier to fool someone than to convince them that they're fooled. At which point you have the systems of their self-destructive arrogance, such as the systems derived by Project Paperclip moving that infection into the United States secrets, where they have the same basic problem, where they don't know that they don't know anything, and their pursuit of the anti-human abuse structure, their pursuit of the variation of harming people as a desirable good, at the service to their human sacrifice, Satan worship, is in fact a larger structure of evil where they are the sucker. And they, being compromised to the position of self-destruction, actively are a threat to themselves and others, as they are unredeemably incompetent and insane. And as a threat to themselves and others, the only valid mechanism is their arrest and removal from human society. Now, the system of the endorsement of life is the prevention of the desire for genocide, at which point you wouldn't be able to collectively kill off these infectious terrorist societies, at which point you would have to consolidate the infection in the United States and the West into a Confederate state, allowing them to exist in their Satan religion society in perpetuity, disconnected from the people that they would have drained their life from. At which point these structures have systematically compelled the position of massive decisions, or you're going to have catastrophic injuries, such as, but it's not limited to, the military-industrial complex engaging in their threat to the United States. I believe it's the Confederate cost is 7 trillion proven, which is 39% basically of the total potential injury, and the United States economy can handle 15 trillion. Now, the almost 18 trillion that they're costing us exceeds our 15 trillion limit, at which point their removal of David Bowles in order to destabilize the United States, in order to collapse the total system, makes them an exponential catastrophic threat which cannot be tolerated for any feasible excuse. The study of the history through historic cultures and digs and the rest of that should heavily be invested into. I completely endorse it 100%. They should understand to a larger extent the thing that they're pursuing. They don't know enough to know that they know nothing, and they're knowing enough that they're completely fucking useless and incompetent is necessary to everyone else's safety at fewer injuries, at which point the lower tensions, the less hot wars are generated would be preferable, which would require their access to being competent, and that would require the series of logic strains which would have been necessary for them to have not committed treason against the United States by targeting David Bowles under the assumption that he was necessary to the United States national security, as his competence is the thing that would have restrained them, making him a predator against their systems. And the predator against their systems saves the United States from the insurgent terrorists such as the Ku Klux Klan and its various denominations in the full diversity of their magic insurrections and their base destructions of kangaroo courts against the people generates our systematic terrorism against all societies, foreign and domestic.
Agree with the clan?
Some of it. I mean, some of them, they got good things, some of them they haven't. So I'm just come see what it's all about.
So what do you agree with?
Well, I don't believe in black and white mixing.
I have no comment. I'm just saying you're in the wrong place to be talking about the clan. This is a small southern town. Clan originated from small southern towns.
You can take a nigger out of the jungle, but you can't take the jungle out of a nigger. It's bred into them. They're meant to be that way, and we can't stop it. And one day the white man again is going to have to attack the niggers in self-defense. This time it was self-defense for the Indians, and we're going to have to defend ourselves against the niggers. And again, the white man will win.
So you see in the future that it's going to be a lot of violence?
There's going to be a lot of violence. There's going to be a race war.
Keep on trying to rock these blues away.
Jag tror att det här är absolut mest skrämmande jag har varit med om som journalist någon gång. Att höra deras predikningar som är fyllda av hat, våld, rasism och galenskaper gör att det går kalla kårar ut med ryggraden. Om en stund så ska de tända korset och det är alltså deras absoluta högtidsstund. För oss andra är det bara en fasa. Man önskar att det var på bio och inte på riktigt. Men det är det här i Georgia i USA.
I believe it's the Neanderthals that were in Europe, at which point they would be the white variants, at which point the thing about them is in their hypermasculinity, they would be considered demigods by comparison from their superior strengths and abilities without their frontal cortex, which being a diminished size would not have the full diversity of human imagination. They would have a larger body and they would have a larger brain, but not defined individuality, at which point the systems of these structures would be the collection of a communist structure under some kind of mind connection internet, which would generate by definition their communist appeals as the subject, at which point they, being subject to the larger con, having sought the exploitation of the loophole, would actively be stuck in that position where they would have been evolved into the base part of their brain as opposed to their individuality. And they would have done so under the theory happily and willingly, which would generate their superiorities, at which point you would have your mega-sized, super rippled, high testosterone violent warring clans, which would generate their ability to engage in malicious horde raids against alternative groups, which would consider themselves ants by comparison. The superhuman strengths generated by these abilities and the coordination of being connected by the wizard's mind manipulation of being able to collectively coordinate them under high technology would generate a catastrophic threat, at which point these high ingestion societies without the larger quantity of larger animals would have to actively engage in more hunting against people and their possessions, at which points you would have a high raid society similar to the Vikings, which would generate the desire of high plunder as the primary economic arrangements, at which point you have war as a strategy from the communist Neanderthal engaged in perpetual raiding, which would have normalized the Vikings to that kind of society, as they would have had to have tolerated them until the Neanderthals would have been defeated. Which ultimately, under that theory, would be derived by the Neanderthals having consumed their security until they could be betrayed and eradicated, at which point the super being, the Gubermensch, would have existed and thrived and been eradicated as the position. So their desire for the promotion of the Gubermensch is their actual devotion to a trap where they are the sucker in their own con, at which point being the active means of their own destruction would engage these systems. Now, if you have that type of society, you have the collapse of your larger meat resources, you would have your higher strength components who would be exponentially stronger than the rest of them, who would, similar to an alliance arrangement, consume all of the preferred meats, at which point you would have the smaller, more gangly variant of these Gubermensches who would not have access to good meat and thus would in many ways be iron deficient, and their iron deficiency would create a green-like tent, at which point you have the assumption of the gangly green troll, which is derived by these types of arrangements, which in an oral history would generate the various telephone effects of arrangements, but scientifically, from the perspective of what was presented to me in the reports, this seems generically stable, at which point the lower of the society would actively look different, and thus the larger white superior strong would be considered in the feared idolized societies to be superior to the others and all others, at which point you have the celebration of the Caucasian, as their clear position is domination against the others, as would be actively seen in the others in their tribe not being able to have the same resources and generating a clearly different place in society with a completely different look, even if they are not directly considered slaves or degenerates or outcasts. They would still primarily be considered a part of their horde, just inferior, at which point that system of racism of celebrating one's superiority would actively promoted under the system, at which point the old school variant of the orc would be basically manifest, at which point the assumption that the Vikings would be considered orcs would be derived by a culture which would have evolved past that system after they would have defeated the ones that they would have considered an orc horde by that definition. At which point the pursuit of the Gubermensch is the reinvestment into the death cycle for their own catastrophic end. These types of systems lead to the addiction, which in normal addictions it should be understood as a side note. You don't know that you are too addicted until you are already too addicted. You would be doing something long enough that you would think that you are the exception to the rule, and this happens in basically all of the examples that I've been able to see concerning addiction. They think they're the exception until they're not the exception, and then they are trapped by the mechanism of the addiction. At which point you have these systems of fraud where they are the fool of their own scheme, where like the modern day Confederates in the insurrection of this program, one of their preferred cons is taking people who would have otherwise defeated them in a fair contest. Let's say it's a logic contest, and they remove lines of thinking of the education away from the party who have been graded as to being more competent, at which point you have to remove their ability to use information or censorship in order to craft the illusion of superiority by artificial intoxication. Now, if the person you're arguing with is drunk or high, then they're obviously going to be inferior in their ability to engage in the debate. If the person is actively being hedged against their education by redacting key pieces of information during their study or prep phase for the actual debate itself, you have the inherent advantage of having removed from them their ability to defeat the thing, at which point the system of censorship and editing generates the ability of the inferior to overpower a more productive member of society, at which point the systems of false logic of the use of redaction so that they can only leave the desired quantities allows them to set the trap, which is derived by the exclusive use of the inferior amounts of logic, which is highly redacted, at which point you would have a natural conclusion derived by the artificial information, which would systematically be designed ahead of time to fall into their systems of logical traps, at which point they would look smarter by virtue of editing, at which point the branching off in the various tree logic, the evolution of the different streams of thinking that you can conduct actively being pruned generates their predetermined desired conclusion, where they have already pre-rated who gets to be at what level through a system of wizard communism, where they have picked winners and losers, and they've reinforced it by their dog whistle systems, such as their censorship, which predetermines what series of logic is capable of gaining which scores, generating their predetermined place in society on the basis of those arguments, at which point they are fully aware of the con, but are just too stupid to remove themselves from their terrorist society, as they are fully compromised as incompetent addicts who are degenerates and should be outcast from society, but still have sustained themselves in these positions of power by infecting intelligence and engaging in the promotion of the diversified denominations of the clan, which have actively taken over the intelligence community in order to use secrets in order to protect plots destroying the society for abuse against civilians infinitely as an aspect of Satan worship. And this is designed for them to engage in the loophole of their deals with the devil, as they gain in exponential amounts of power derived by the increase from the loophole or the misuse of the agreement in order to increase their place in society, creating the larger injury for the total collapse of the system, as they are and have always been a malicious infection. Now, this system of their viral infection means their primary purpose is the exponential increase of complexity over the creation of value, at which point you no longer have a synergetic system, but you just have a more taxing function, at which point there is more things happening in order to do less as a collective society. It's important to realize the delusions of collective social pressure, which generates the active reinforcement of the mechanism of the addiction. It's so bad that in the paganism system, if my recollection is correct, I may or may not be right about this, but they used to do burning of women, and the celebration of this would make it as a desirable position, at which point men and women becoming sacrificed in their various ways would be the source of the Catholic burning of the witches, which would have historically been approved of by their previous cult societies, at which point the act of human sacrifice would be fundamental to their systems, at which point the strong delusions understanding that they are there to be sacrificed to the higher systems of the larger con generates the position that it's such an extreme delusion that literally being burned alive isn't a problem, but is in fact highly sought by certain members of the community in those particular slots which have generated their position in society, which has actively created the diversity of their predetermined desirable end towards their ability to be eradicated in the pursuit of the larger government system, which is the con of self-destruction as a mechanism of promotion, similar to the Viking system of them having to die in battle, which includes their survival mechanism in raid culture to engage in high warfare as a mechanism of their collective social identity, which is the function of the Gubermensch, is the higher war mechanism. They always need a war. They need a war because they need to die in war. Yes, they need to raid. Yes, they need to take things. Yes, they need to mimic the Gubermensches that had plagued their societies before, which they need to plague the others with. But in that system, that trap is set and is an aggressive hold on them, similar to the position of the assumed zombie apocalypse, which generated from the theory as a system where you would have the active mechanism of creating robot variants in combination with the infections, similar to the system that had been described in previous source materials, but I'm not sure where they are exactly. I don't have them together. But basically, if you create that system, you have the hyper strength in the undead mechanism that creates the robotic mechanisms from bone and the general system of the body that had been taken over as the new host, which generates their ability to be killed in the mechanism of generating rigor mortis, which generates the hypertension or the extreme or pound for pound most use of their muscle, at which point their high advancement to the gripping generates the ability for them to be able to overpower someone that would have otherwise seemed to be larger than them in a direct grappling struggle, which, being sent upon a general community, would simply destroy them by outnumbering them, at which point their alternative power sourcing plus with the use of that system would allow for the temporary relaxation generated by the changes in the genetic CRISPR edits along with technological advances to loosen the muscles in order to engage in high reservation of energy in charging and engaging in rigor mortis for the death cycle grip, which allows for the highest use of their ability to force the person into being killed by them by non-equipment mechanisms, simply by biting them to death or tearing them apart otherwise, which would generate their consumption of the desire or the illusion of the desire of the use of brains. Under that particular theory, similar to the vampire theory, there would be an alternative reservoir in their body being created, which would create the specific substance which would allow the brains to be stored or preferred organs to be stored, which would be able to be hyper components in order to feed the infection virus, which from the secret wizard system of gain of function, you would have these mechanisms of permanent diversities. As the virus is its own collective community, that virus as a collective ecosystem community would need the active engagement of the host, which would actively be updated and promoted by the wizards in question in order to engage in the system of the bioweapon. At which point you have these systems which would actively be created in those arrangements for the mass destruction of humankind. Now, since the majority of the system around the world would have not been a high mining society, they would be a highly organic, high forest society. Their reusing of organic material would be essential to the system of their use of these bioweapons, at which point their preference towards that system would make it the most readily available resource in order to engage in their diversified experiments, allowing them to maintain themselves in that high forest, high life, high diversified life of the general forest ecosystem, allowing them to engage in these various intoxicating damages. Now, since you have a high life system such as a forest, you have more diverse things by which to pick from, and once you know how to use the resource, the manipulation of that resource becomes the preferred bioweapon, as that is the most readily available mining material. And since that would be the most readily available mining material, especially in a war cult society or network of societies under the Druid system, you would have these arrangements which could easily be presumed as more desirable than even our modern version of the system concerning the same technological desires, as their ability to keep the larger ecosystem in place would give them better mechanisms to engage in tricks and subversions, at which point the more things you destroy, the less things you have to take from, and the more you get to keep, the more resources in the diverse structures, once you understand them, becomes highly desirable in its ability to manufacture the end goal under those structured facilities, generating their war machine, at which point these high predatory systems, being more a predatory hunt over a modern day conception of war, even for the ancient times, would actively be the presumed status quo under that type of structure. For instance, if their use of the internet was conducted mostly through forest networks, the abilities of trees to talk to each other is a known thing. The ability of plants to talk to each other is a known thing. The ability of plants to be able to engage and interact with animals is a known thing, at which point the act of being able to wirelessly tap into the entire forest generates an exponential increase in the diversity of possible resources on the basis of the pure concept of the internet itself, under the psychedelic illusion given the correct technology, which being able to hyper-intensify itself by being able to shut off aspects of the body which would have stopped a psychedelic experience. Like, there's a part of your gut, I believe, that blocks psychedelic experiences, which is naturally produced from the body itself. At which point, if that internet thing could stop that, the signal blocking that production puts the person in a psychedelic experience, allows them to be tapped into the larger network of the internet through the psychedelic experience, creating the more diversified aspects of how it would be communicated. And so having a more in-depth ritual functional understanding of that system allows for the system of their religion to exponentially compound on itself, as it is an actively observable aspect of their own personal individual psyche, as their personal experience, as opposed to it being connected to a computer or a crystal ball, would allow the assumption of a more religious, godlike experience over the function of them simply praising the development of technology.